In this voice thread, we're going to take a look at how ecosystems are put together using the living players that we just discussed in previous voice thread. We talked about the different kingdoms of living organisms, and so now basically what we're going to do is we're going to hand them their scripts and we're going to see where they fit in, what their roles are, what their parts are in this little drama we call an ecosystem. So we're going to look at the idea of ecosystem structure. We're going to put our ecosystem together. And my introductory slide here is of a pretty little green snake. Now he's green, and so is the leaf that he's around, but there's a big difference between these guys, and that is that the leaf does photosynthesis, and of course our little snake doesn't, even though he's green. And we're going to see that these two things have very different roles in the ecosystem. We'll start out our ecosystem by putting in our primary energy source. And the primary energy source for all the ecosystems that we're ever likely to come in contact with is, of course, the sun. And so the sun is providing energy, and it's providing very high quality energy. And that high quality energy is in the form of light. High quality sunlight. That's what's driving our ecosystems and making our ecosystems work. So now we've got our light in our ecosystem. We've got a source of energy, but we also need matter. The matter is going to consist of things like nitrogen out here in the environment that needs to be put into a form that we'll be able to use, and it consists of oxygen out here, and we got to have some water out here. We got to have all these things in our environment. And of course, remember, energy is what makes matter move in a direction it wouldn't normally go. This part of the environment where we find all of these things like oxygen and nitrogen and so on, these are part of the abiotic environment. And so we've got to get all of these guys brought up into the biotic part. They're in the abiotic, but we got to get them in the biotic part. And so the way we do that, we'll investigate in the next page of this voice. Consider for a minute all of the various things that you use during the day. How many of the things that you actually use in your daily life, whether it be your toaster oven or your car or your computer, how many of those things did you actually build yourself from scratch, from the very most basic components? Well, I suspect that you didn't build very much of it. Most of us can't build a brand new car from iron ore and aluminum ore and crude oil and things like that in our garage. And in fact, even if we were already given the pieces, most of us would probably have a hard time putting our car together. But you need to consider that things like water and things like carbon dioxide and things like oxygen and things like potassium and phosphorus and all these things that we find in our environment that living things require, well, they're out here in a form that we can't use, okay? And remember, we are in the abiotic part of the environment here. Okay, and we cannot use these various pieces. We can't put them together to make what we need. Well, it turns out that we have some organisms that can put these things together. And these organisms are called the producers. And they consist of plants, certain protista, and certain types of bacteria, remember the cyanobacteria, that can all do a particular process. They can all do a process called photosynthesis. Remember what that word means. Photo means light, okay, here's our light over here, and synthesis means putting together. What are they putting together? They are putting together these abiotic materials, these various gases and nutrients and things like that, and they are moving them from the abiotic part of the system up here to the biotic part of the system. Okay, well now think about this for a minute. Isn't that what a factory does? Over in the middle part of Tennessee, near the town of Smyrna, there is a factory that produces Nissan pickup trucks. My brother-in-law happens to work there. They take all the parts, the pulleys and the belts and the screws and the sheet metal and the doorknobs and the water pumps and the crankshafts and the spark plugs and all that stuff that you and I can't do anything with. And they put them together in just the right way. How about that idea of emergent properties, right? They're all in a particular relationship to each other, and they make something called a truck or a vehicle. Okay? They can put it together even though we can't. And we talk about, well, when somebody makes something, what are they doing? They are producing something. And the Nissan factory produces these things we call automobiles, okay? And it just so happens that we have another name for a factory. Nobody really ever refers to the Nissan factory or the Nissan production facility. No, they call it the Nissan plant. The plant. And there's a reason we call factories plants. It's because plants can take the things that we can't use over here in the abiotic part of the environment, and they can, through the process of photosynthesis, turn it into things we can use. And when the plants get done with it, they have now moved that material into the biotic part of the environment. Okay, so plants, they're factories. They are producers. They produce materials that the rest of us can use. Okay, so our friends the plants, they've made good stuff for us here. Okay, they have produced something that we can use. Just like a factory, just like the Nissan plant might produce automobiles. So we've put the abiotic stuff together and we've made something biotic out of it. But remember, what does matter do in the ecosystem? What does matter do? Matter cycles. Matter always cycles. So if we bring it this way and put it into the living part of the system, what's going to eventually have to happen? Well, eventually it's going to have to go this way and go back to the abiotic part of the system. Eventually we got to put it back. All right? We put stuff together here. Okay, I'll make a plus sign. That means we added stuff together, put stuff together. Over here on the other side, at some point, we're going to have to take it apart again, okay, in order to make sure that the matter cycles. So sometimes things get made, but they don't ever get used, and they end up at the junkyard or whatever, and they will eventually break down. And that's what we're going to look at in the next page of this twist thread. So we've taken materials from the abiotic and put them into the biotic part of the system through the process of photosynthesis, and now the carbon and oxygen and nitrogen and phosphorus and all those wonderful things are over here in the biotic part of the system. But because the matter cycles, we have to eventually put it back. Well, putting it back is the role of a group of organisms called the decomposers. And the decomposers consist primarily of, remember these guys, bacteria, members of the kingdom Monera. We have bacteria, and we also have fungi. See if I get my F to right here. There we go. Fungi. Bacteria and fungi. They are the decomposers. And so here we have some mushrooms, and their job is to decompose. And what they're doing is they're taking the material from the biotic part of the environment, breaking it down again, and returning it to the abiotic part of the environment. The producers, they put together. The decomposers, they take apart. And there's a process in the course of doing that. Photosynthesis, putting together, well, our taking about process has a name. It's called, remember this from the carbon cycle? Respiration. Respiration is the process of taking it apart again. We put it together with photosynthesis, we take it apart with respiration, and it is the job of the decomposers. Okay, so we have the plants, they're taken care of up here in the producers. We have bacteria and fungi down here, and they've taken care of things, putting stuff back. They've put the material back into the abiotic part of the system. Also, we have certain kinds of protista that participate up here in the producer area as well. Okay, so who's missing? Who haven't we got? Let's see. We got plants. We got blue-green algae. We got regular algae in the protista up here. Down here we got our bacteria and fungi. Who's left? Oh, I think I know, and we'll meet them in the next page. Normally, when a plant produces something, when a factory produces something, it's not going to go right to the recycling facility and be broken back down again. This makes a complete cycle as we look at the going from the abiotic to the biotic over here, and then coming back down by way of the decomposers over here. Yeah, that's a complete cycle, but that's not usually the way things go. Usually, when a factory produces something, they do what with it? Well, they sell it to somebody. And what do we call somebody who goes to the store and buys something that was produced at a plant, at a factory? Well, of course, we call them consumers. So an ecosystem also has consumers. This represents an alternate pathway for the matter and the energy to go. And in this case, we have a cute little mouse representing our consumer. So the consumer can eat parts of the plant, and now that matter and energy goes into the consumer. The consumer uses it for a little while, but eventually the consumer is going to succumb to the efforts of the decomposer. Keep in mind that consumers are also doing respiration as well. Okay? Now it might be that the mouse might eat some of the plant, but a snake might come up and eat the mouse, and a bird might come up and eat the snake. Oh, you can have more than one consumer, right? If a person buys a new car, they might drive it for a few years, but are they just going to take it to the automobile recycling facility after that? No, they're going to sell it to somebody else, and they're going to be the second owner, and so on and so on. Eventually, the car will wear out to the point where it needs to go to the recycling facility, but it may pass through several hands in the process of doing that. Now, also keep in mind our mantra: matter cycles, energy flows. Okay, so the matter, which I'll put in purple ink here, the matter has to keep going around and around like this. It's going to go through producers, and it's going to go through consumers, and it's going to go through decomposers, and then it's going to go back into the producers again, and around and around and around, because the matter cycles. But remember, the energy flows. So the energy is coming through like this, and it's coming through these guys, and it's going to come through the decomposers, but eventually it's going to leave. And it leaves in the form of heat energy flowing into the environment. So the matter is going to keep cycling. The oxygen and the carbon and the nitrogen and the phosphorus and all that stuff keeps cycling, but the energy comes in as high quality light, and it is going to leave as low quality heat. Let's take a look at these same concepts, except maybe from a slightly different point of view. You may want to turn in your textbook to figure 5.6 on page 102, and that's where you'll find this particular figure here. And that might make following along with this discussion a little bit easier. In this figure, notice that we still have our energy from the sun, solar energies coming in. It's being captured by plants, and notice that the energy is also coming out. But notice that each type of organism is losing heat energy. So the energy comes out as heat all along here. Okay, all of these organisms are losing heat, and eventually all of the energy will escape. All of the energy that originally came in as sunlight is going to escape as heat. We can't get around our first and second laws of energy. Notice also we have our producer here. Okay, here's a plant, that's a producer. We have consumers. In this case we have 3, and we'll talk about that a little more in just a second. And we also have our decomposers over here. Now, one thing about this figure that I don't particularly care for is that they have the decomposers at the very, very end. And you need to realize that the decomposers, they are operating all along here. The decomposers operate everywhere. Okay? So don't think that decomposers are just happening at the end after the last consumer. Not so. Decomposers are happening everywhere. Now, when we arrange our ecosystem like this, we're generating something called a food chain. We're looking at something called the food chain. And a food chain has something that's very important to understand. It has something called trophic, T-R-O-P-H, not tropic, but trophic levels. Trophic levels. Trophic means feeding. And so we have trophic levels or feeding levels. All right, and if we look at the labels up here, we see this is the first trophic level, then we have the second trophic level, the third trophic level, the fourth trophic level, and so on. Now, decomposers, remember we said they can happen anywhere? They're a trophic level unto themselves. We don't assign them a number. We just say they are decomposers at the decomposer trophic level. So trophic levels or feeding levels. Now let's take a look at that a little more closely. Here we are at the first trophic level, and the first trophic level represents the plants. And so another word for the first trophic level, these are the producers, okay? The producers, the plants, first trophic levels. Now, we talk about feeding in terms of what do you feed on? Well, what do plants feed on? I guess you could say they feed on carbon dioxide, water, and things like that. But the ecologist says, well, they don't feed on other things. They manufacture their own food. Remember, they're manufacturing. They are producers. They are the factories. They're manufacturing their own. They're making their own food. And so we have a name for that. The plants are referred to as autotrophs. Autotrophs. Come on. Oh, pen can't keep up here. Autotrophs. And that literally means self-feeders because they make their own food. So the first trophic level, that's the producers, and another name for the producers is autotrophs, self-feeders. So the plants, they have captured the energy from the sun. They have put together the matter from the abiotic part of the environment. And since they do more photosynthesis than respiration, they have grown. They have accumulated biomass. And that biomass is of interest to the second trophic level, the first consumers. And since they're the first consumers, we call them the primary consumer. If you go down to a car dealership and buy a brand new car, you are the first owner of the car. You are the primary or first consumer. Now, they're at the second trophic level. Even though they're the first consumer, they are at the second trophic level. And they're feeding on something, but they're not self-feeders. They're not making their food out of nothing. They're feeding on food that has already been produced. And so we call these guys other feeders, and the fancy word for that is heterotroph. So we have these things called hetero, pen to work here, heterotroph. And heterotroph literally means other feeder. They're eating other things. Now, we also can talk about this in terms of another piece of vocabulary. We have this mouse and it's eating a plant. The key word there is eating. And it turns out there's a fancy word that refers to eating. And that term is vor, V-O-R-E. Vor means eating. That's different than feeding. Troph means feeding. Vor means eating. And so Mousy up here, what's he eating? Well, he's eating the plant. So that makes him a plant eater. And the word we have for that is herbivore. Okay, the mouse is an herbivore, a plant eater. An other feeder, but a plant eater. Okay, what's going to happen next? Well, now we got Snaky over here. And Snake is going to eat the mouse. The snake is at the third trophic level, but he's at the third trophic level, but he's only the second consumer. And so we refer to him as a secondary consumer. Well, how would we describe how he eats? Is he making his own food, or is he feeding on something else? Well, obviously he's feeding on something else. He's eating the mouse over there. And so that makes the snake, just like the mouse, the snake is a heterotroph, just like the mouse was. Sorry about my poor writing here, but it's difficult to write some of these words down. Okay, so he is a heterotroph. And he's also eating. Okay, remember we have that word vor. Okay, but he's not eating plant material, is he? No, he's eating mouse material. And mice aren't plants. Mice are, well, mice are meat. And so we now have, he's an other feeder. Okay, heterotroph means other feeder, but he's a meat eater. In other words, he is a carnivore. Carnivore, a meat eater. Other feeder, meat eater. Secondary consumer at the third trophic level. Okay, now we're at the fourth trophic level, and here's Mr. Hawk. And Mr. Hawk swoops in, and he's going to grab up that snake, and he's going to have him for dinner. He's at the fourth trophic level, but count them up now. We've had 1, 2, he's the third, or the tertiary consumer. Okay? He now has the matter and the energy that was in the snake, who got its matter and energy from the mouse, who got its matter and energy from the plant. Once again, the hawk is not manufacturing its own food out of air and water. He has to eat something else, and so our friend the hawk, he is still just like the snake and the mouse. He is a heterotroph. Okay, he's still a heterotroph. And snakes, well, they're not made out of plant material. Okay, so what is that hawk eating? He's eating meat or flesh, and so the hawk is also a carnivore. Okay, the hawk is also a carnivore, just like the snake was. So hawks and snakes, well, they got a little bit in common, don't they? Think about this for a minute. Remember, we said don't worry about the decomposers over here. They kind of go on their own thing. This was unfortunate the way that they drew this. Okay, let's forget these for a little bit. And think about this. What eats hawks? Now, what eats hawks? Well, actually, nothing really. And so we say that hawks are top predators, or they're at the top of the food chain. All right. Well, let's go on and let's get this next. Let's figure out what's going on with these decomposers. We said that our friends, the decomposers, represent their own trophic level unto themselves. And we said that the decomposers, they're operating all along this thing we call a food chain. They're not just at the end, but they can be dealing with mice and snakes and hawks. All of these things are going to eventually be dealt with our friends, the decomposers. Okay, so they represent their own separate part of the system. And we're going to look a little bit more at the decomposers in just a second. But while we're on this slide, on this page, notice the energy. Once again, the energy comes in as sunlight, and at every link in the food chain, at every single link in the food chain, energy is coming out. And it's coming out in the form of low quality heat. And eventually, the decomposers, they're going to finish it off. The decomposers release the last energy, and that heat is then going to go into the environment, and it's now gone forever. Getting back to our friends, the decomposers, for a second. Of course, decomposers consist of fungi, like these guys right here, mushrooms and fungi, and they also consist of various types of bacteria, like what we see over here. But those aren't the only things that come into some interesting places in the food chain. We have another way of, just like we had another way of describing the mouse and the snake and the hawk, we said we can look at it in terms of what they feed on, but we can also look at them in terms of what they eat. Well, you know, what does a mushroom eat? What does bacteria eat? For that matter, what does this guy right here? What does a buzzard eat? Well, buzzards eat dead things, and we have a word for dead stuff. Dead stuff is called detritus, and something that eats detritus is called a detritivore. Okay, detritivores are things that eat dead stuff. So that would be like buzzards and vultures and the mushrooms and the bacteria and things like that. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, I don't eat things while they're still alive, so I eat dead things, but you actually or human beings actually, if you'll pardon the phrase, do the killing. And we usually don't just happen upon something dead out in the environment and decide to go ahead and eat it. Although here in the great state of Tennessee, we do have something called the roadkill law. So if you find some fresh roadkill, some fresh squirrel or possum or raccoon, it is legal for you to harvest that carcass and take it home and enjoy it, as it were. Personally, I don't think I'm going to go there. But eventually, everything ends up at either the fungi or the bacteria, and the fungi and the bacteria, they are the final decomposers. They do the final breakdown and completely dismantle living things, move material from the biotic part of the environment to the abiotic part of the environment. Okay, we got a little bit of a typo here. Let's get rid of this. This reference is not correct. But this figure is in your textbook, but it's actually figure 5.7, and it's on page 103. So if you go to page 103 in your textbook, that's where you'll find this particular image. Now, think about a food chain for a second. Is that how systems really work? This eats that, that eats that, that eats that, and that's that? Do mice only eat certain little plants? Do snakes only eat certain little mice? Do hawks only eat certain black snakes? Well, no. You know that doesn't make sense. And there's a reason for that. It turns out that in ecosystems, when things get more complex, the ecosystem is better off. Ecosystems kind of like complexity. Complexity is a good thing. We can think of this complexity as diversity. Think about how you get from where you live to where you work. Okay? Is there only one way to get from where you live to where you work? Probably not. What would be the problem, though, if there were only one way? What would be the issue that you'd have to deal with? Well, what if something happened to block your way? What if there was an accident or a landslide or something happened to block your way? Well, then you couldn't get to work. Then you'd be in trouble. But most of us have more than one way to get from one place to another. We often have our preferred route. There's the way we would prefer to do it. But if something happens and that's not available to us, we can always fall back to plan B or plan C. And it's the same way with the ecosystems. Ecosystems don't really work in nice straight line food chains. Instead, what we find are lots of food chains that are interacting with each other. And they form these complex feeding patterns called, you probably guessed it, food webs. Food webs are the complex feeding patterns that exist within the ecosystem. And they make a lot of sense. They represent choices. They represent options. Okay, they represent fallback plans. So for instance, if something were to happen to all the little mice here, and all of a sudden there are no more mice in the ecosystem, are the snakes and the owls, and is my snake over here and my owl and my fox, are they all going to die? No, of course not. They're just going to shift over to something else. Oh, no mice? Not a problem. Now we'll eat the birds and the rabbits. There's something to fall back on. Okay, the ecosystem doesn't completely fall apart. Now in this diagram, and you can see it better in your textbook, the arrows point in the direction that the matter and the energy go. So the arrow points from, for instance, from this blackberry bush, it points towards the rabbit because that's the way the matter and the energy is going to go. Notice that we don't have any arrows pointing to the decomposers up here. Okay, and that's because the decomposers can operate at any level. Notice down here we have producers, and then right in here we have a lot of primary consumers. Right in here we have some secondary consumers. So it all still makes sense, except now we're looking at it in terms of something that's a little more realistic. We're looking at the ecosystem and the movement of matter and energy in terms of a food web and not just a food chain.